Welcome to SportsTokz Office Hours. I'm your host, Dan Berlin, along with my co-host this week and Sportsnet.ca feature writer, David Singh. Today we have a very special guest joining us, Sportsnet's own Donnovan Bennett, feature host, producer, and radio host amongst the many hats that he wears. And Donovan's work, of course, touches on the intersections between sports and race, politics, gender, and pop culture. I didn't just come up with that. That's right in your bio, Donnovan. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. It's great to have you here.
No problem. My pleasure.
Excellent. So, in terms of, just getting this conversation started here, a lot of different things we want to touch on, including, the changing media landscape and how you've adopted your practices, some best practices as it relates to your craft, being a journalist, and of course, talking a little bit about some of the issues facing the world of sport and of course, the world outside of sport as well. David, why don't you begin?
Yeah, I'll start with, Donnovan, you have your hand in writing, television, digital video, podcasting, radio, and, feel free to add anything if I'm missing anything. But one question I have is there one area that you actually prefer, like one that really gets your blood flowing of all those?
Yeah, that is a good question. I'd say feature interviews, to be honest, right? Like I am, my wife argues that I'm a bit antisocial when the social calendar is filled with her friends and not mine. But I just really love talking to people. Like I just love having conversations like this. And so the ability to sit down with an athlete or administrator, executive, commissioner, or, the way I have done in the past, a fan, and really conversate with them, pull out some interesting facts about them and learn their story and tell their story is something that I really enjoy. I think it's probably the thing that comes the most natural to me, but it's also the thing I find to be the most rewarding. And so we are opposites in the sense that you have a gift in terms of your ability to write. Like not everyone can, with a MacBook or a pen, basically paint a picture, right? It literally is art, but for many people, it's arduous, it's rough, difficult work. And so that's a gift that you have that not many people have. For me, writing is it's like the penance that I pay. It's like the thing that I do to allow me to do a bunch of other things. And so certainly at times it's been therapeutic. And certainly many times it's been the best platform and the most efficient platform to get across what I want to say. But I feel most comfortable and the most natural, I would say, sitting down, in a chair, hopefully not from too much longer on Zooms, but hopefully like in person, right? Socially distanced, of course, but in person, doing interviews, talking to people, and I have, heard kind of anecdotally, that's kind of where I've differentiated myself from a lot of people in our industry. And there is an art and a craft to it, certainly, and I do work hard at it, but it is something that, I kind of feel like a duck in water when I'm doing a feature interview.
Well, it's interesting too, because there's a lot you could unpack there. I'd love to hear more about how you sort of deep dive into these feature interviews, gain trust, what some of your kind of secrets are to develop that rapport and be able to get the subject to open up. Why don't we kind of start there? How do you sort of play that? Maybe you can even share an example of an interview, a subject that you really look back on fondly as going well.
Yeah, I can't give away all the secrets. I got to keep a little something for me. It's like, your grandmother, when she passes on the recipe, she doesn't give you all the details, right? But we'll save that for like a future, Ryerson course or something. We'll make it part of the curriculum. But no, I think you use the word and it's trust, right? Like in a sense, in a way, I'm almost like a therapist. Right? Like it's not about me, literally. And I think that's the biggest mistake and misconception when people go into a feature interview is that it is actually the opposite if you're in studio or on camera, where you want to bring a lot of personality and energy. Certainly you want to bring your authentic self, but it's actually not about you. And many of the questions that you ask, and some of the best one, may never appear on camera. Right? But your goal is to bring out good sound, interesting sound that people haven't heard before. And that's what's going to separate your interview, and do it in a way that makes the subject comfortable so that they really expand. And so I kind of think of it as, you're almost like playing tennis, but you always want the person to return, right? You never want to hit winners. And so there are some strategic things in the mechanics of what I do to make it a little bit more of a comfortable situation. I'll always small talk, before the camera is rolling, just to get that person warmed up, right? Get the engine going a little bit. I'll have canvassed their social media, not just for the research for the interview, but also just to make some small talk about them and whatnot. One of my go-tos with athletes, and it's like a calling card, in that, like, the cameramen that I work with a lot know I'm going to ask it, so they know they have a little bit more time to calibrate their cameras. And so I always ask athletes, how's the body feeling? Right? Because that's just something that they always have an appraisal of. They always have like something that they can complain about or not, right? They're always in that mind of canvassing, well, how is my body feeling? So I'm empathetically saying, hey, how are you doing, right? How's your body feeling? How are you, whether it's coming out of training camp or the middle of the season where it's tough, or the end of the season playoffs, like the body's always an issue at some point. Even going into a season, right? Like, how was your training? How is your rehab? So how's the body feeling? I'll ask that, and just getting them to talk, warming them up a little bit. Another thing I'll always do is I'll always tell them exactly what we're doing. Listen, I'm not sure if you know, I'm not sure if the PR person let you know, but I'll tell you, this is what we're doing. This is what we're looking to do. These are the types of things I'm going to ask. We're going to be here for X amount of time, just so they can start to set some expectations, right? Mm-hmm. Oh, it's 15 minutes. Okay, it's not going to be an hour. Or it's 15 minutes and not 5 minutes. Okay, I'm going to get comfortable because I'm going to be here for a little bit. So they have that understanding and that awareness. And they know that, oh, we want to talk about this. So I can know for sure there's not going to be any gotcha questions about A, B, or C that I'm a little bit fearful of. So make them feel comfortable. Another thing I'll often say, and I'll say this to everyone, but it really matters more in younger athletes, amateur athletes, or athletes where English is not their first language, or just maybe people with trepidation around interviews. Hey, this is not live. Anything you want to re-say or rephrase, we can do that. I want to make sure that this is a best representation of you and your thoughts, and that they are your best words. Cool. And normally they're like, okay, yeah, cool. And we I can count on one hand of the probably thousands of interviews that I've done where we've actually had to redo anything or re-say anything. And oftentimes it has more to do with someone walking in the background or a camera that rolled out than what was actually said. But the ability to know, like, okay, I don't have to get this perfect. I can get a mulligan, again, puts them at ease. So there are things like that, social things, sociological things, psychological things that no one really sees on camera. But even before the cameras roll, I'm working, I'm competing. I want that interview to be more comfortable and thus more interesting than the interview they're going to do with the next person or the next person after that.
I love the idea of having an interview be like a tennis match going back and forth, and you always want them to return it. Absolutely love that. I've never heard anybody put it that way.
I actually never put it that way before. I just thought of it right now. So there you go.
It's perfect. And you talked about getting your interview subject to warm up. One really, fantastic piece that you've done that always sticks out in my head is from February, right before COVID, Breaking Bread with Austin Matthews. Can you take us through the ideation process of that? Because I think that was unique in that it really told a side of Austin Matthews that not a lot of people know about.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you. That's a good one. And that's actually one of my favorite pieces. And I'd love to, expand on that and do more with Austin in the future. And I find Austin to be a fascinating character, right? Like, just the thought of Austin Matthews, never mind him as a person, this young kid from Arizona, one of the most dominant hockey players in the league. But he wasn't, raised in the traditional either Northeast United States or Canadian hockey culture, but yet he's playing in the mecca of hockey here in Toronto. So that juxtaposition has always fascinated me. And if your students can take one thing from this entire podcast or lesson that we do, I think this would be it. So, like, the kids that are like half asleep, like slumped in the chair, like, perk up just for this answer. The relationships are currency, right? In all walks of life. And in our industry, that's certainly the case. And one of the most valuable relationships that you're going to have, like it's going to be like the yen in terms of currency, is a relationship with PR, with public relations officers. And so that interview, that concept came through my relationship with a PR person, a woman by the name of Jasmine Garfor, who works for the NHL. Used to work in media, and so I know her from her times at the Score. We sat down at the beginning of the year and we kind of strategized and said, okay, listen, I want some great features that no one else is doing, that talk about all the things that was mentioned, right? Intersections between sports and race and culture and all these things. And you in the NHL have some milestones that you're trying to hit and things you're trying to promote. And a new thing for the NHL was the fact that they were celebrating Hispanic heritage for the first time ever. They had a Latin website. The first month of the season was dedicated towards it. And it's like, okay, well, how can we do both things? How can I get a great interview and you promote that fact that you guys are leaning in that space? And she said, Austin Matthews, would be great. And his mother makes an amazing Azteca soup. She gives it to a bunch of teammates and whatnot. And doing something with them would be great. Maybe even get with them in the kitchen. And so the idea evolved. Like we didn't do the interview with him and his mom in the kitchen because the soup takes like literally 7 hours to make. So that didn't make sense. But we went to a restaurant, an authentic Mexican restaurant here in Toronto. They kind of made the soup and the meals for them. And we talked about the food and what it meant to their family and what her heritage meant to him and his upbringing and how his upbringing in the sport was entirely different, right? She did not know about hockey or its culture. She just wanted her kid to be active. Going to the arena was a reprieve from the heat in Arizona, right? That's their relationship to sport hockey, which is entirely different than it was for us here in Canada. But I do think that the fact that he was raised a bit differently impacts his fashion and just different things that he tries on the ice that you would never really think someone would if they were just in the mold of, I am a young hockey player. I billeted when I was a kid. And in this situation, I always have to dump the puck and get off the ice. And so that was the genesis of the conversation. And so we talked about the fact that the lack of pressure as a young kid really helped him, hone his skills. But we also talked at the same time about, here's a guy who represents the United States, both on the ice, but as a symbol, and has this great Mexican heritage that he's proud of. But yet the leader of the country that he lives in, the president, is talking about the fact that people from Mexico are bringing drugs and they're bringing crime. And I just wonder how that feels for someone who's so fiercely proud. And so that was a good chance to really learn about him through his mom. The best sound bites for me in that interview was Emma Matthews, not Austin.
Yeah.
Right. But we learned still about Austin, and Austin's really the person that the most of the audience cares about. But I also think the presence of Emma Matthews brought out a different side of Austin that we don't normally see. And that I think was good to see. But again, your relationships with PR, both team and league level, are really important. And it is a mutually beneficial relationship. And you mentioned the piece came out in February. Part of the reason it came out in February, and it didn't come out in October at the beginning of the season, is because, as you may or may not remember, Austin Matthews was in a legal situation at the time.
Yes.
And so there had to be some trust on both sides that, listen, we've agreed to this interview, that has nothing to do with why we want to talk to Austin Matthews, that we're going to let the legal situation play out and not post it before it does, because all of the comments and the lens that it will be viewed will be through that lens and not through the lens of the story that I'm hoping to tell. Obviously, Austin and his mom want to tell, but the league also wants to tell. And the team, obviously, is trying to safeguard his reputation. So there's, again, some mutually beneficial ways to make sure that, you're partners with PR in trying to do good things, because there are PR professionals, quite frankly, that lead with no, and that really just understand that anything that I say yes to is just further exposure for my boss, the team president, to say, this quote is terrible, or this story has a terrible slant. Why did this happen? But if we say no to everything and just allow what we need to happen, at the end of the year, when I get my Christmas bonus, my team president, Mark Shapiro or Masai Ujiri, isn't saying, I think we really needed 4 more great profiles this year. They're saying, like, no, there were no fires. Outstanding. Here's your Christmas bonus. So there are some people who, because of that incentive or lack thereof, they lead with no when you're trying to do something that's a little bigger in scope, it's a little bit more interesting, that might be a little bit more risque. And those are the things that for us perform well. So you have to have a shared trust and understanding that everyone's going to feel good about the story, unless you're doing something investigative where your loyalty is to the truth.
Yeah, I think there's so many amazing points there, Donnovan, just as it relates to being able to tell another side to the story. And I think that human interest side is always going to captivate an audience. But, bring it all back to the very first thing you said, this idea of currency and relationships as a currency. Obviously, your relationship with the athlete, to get them to open up, to build the trust and have the currency with the mother, to get her to agree to be a part of the story and open up, is one part of it. This idea about building rapport and trust with PR is instrumental, because of course they become gatekeepers and will give you the access that you're looking for. So a lot of what you talked about, how to build trust, part of it is your brand and your work and what you stand for. And when your work is excellent, the way yours is, you get opportunities. Another part of it is obviously having ideas, well flushed out ideas that you can honestly say, maybe you weren't thinking about this, but here's something and it's well planned and well thought out. I think we can do this. And I love how you attached a peg to it with respect to the Heritage Month, because listen, that is a great peg and it resonates. I had an example. I used to work very closely with the Buffalo Bills, and it also comes down to, when you have the trust, you also get opportunities that maybe you're not necessarily pitching, but because you have a reputation, they're thinking, hey, we want this story told. Who are we going to give this story to? And I had a situation where I'd been working closely with the Bills. I tried to let my work speak for itself. And when Terrell Owens, signed with the Buffalo Bills, we got the exclusive interview with him. We had to fly down to Washington, and we were the first, we being Sportsnet. At the time, I was a producer there, and Arash Madani was had just started with Sportsnet. We got an exclusive interview. So there's no question, this really does in many ways come down to relationships, and I really think you did an eloquent way of explaining that. So listen, you have a situation like this Austin Matthews story. You obviously know it's going to be a hit. You know it's going to be a great story. How do you kind of decide which platform, what treatment you want to give the story to? I mean, we live in a multimedia age. You do so many different things. How do you try to hit the mark and figure out which platform to use?
Yeah, that's another great question. And I'm, pretty platform agnostic. Like, I don't really have a preference. I'm loyal to whatever makes the most sense, which my wife hates when I say that, because she doesn't believe in cliches. But I mean, cliches are around for a reason, because they're true. And, for me, I'm really looking at seeing, okay, well, how much meat can I get off the bone, and are there ways that I can repurpose content, not just for one platform, but for multiple? Is there a social media execution to this that makes sense? Is the conversation so fascinating that we could just strip the audio from it and make it a podcast? Or if it's a video essay, is the writing strong enough that, we can make it an opening on a podcast? One of the recent pieces that I did that I'm proud of was a letter to my son, just talking to him about this racial reckoning that we have, and what this period is like, and what I hope it is like for him in the future. And that was a video essay, but the literal letter, we repurposed to be a digital written piece. And the digital written piece, has gotten, as many, if not more views than the video has. And whenever people reference it, I'm kind of like, okay, like, are you actually talking about like the physical letter? Like, did you read it, or the idea, the concept of me writing a letter to my son via essay? So I'm constantly trying to think, how many platforms does this make sense at? Because, a good idea is a good idea. I just really don't want to waste it. But certainly I think one of the benefits of me working at Sportsnet is I've been able to kind of lily pad back and forth between platforms and do some things on different ones and dabble to see what works and what doesn't, and use that evidence to be a little bit more thoughtful and evidence-based on where I'm deciding what may work. The real question for me is, where my voice will have some amplification on the topic. So there's sometimes where, there may be an issue that is really serious, and I want to be somewhat thorough in my explanation of how I feel. And I want to bring in lots of different references and provide, further examples. And then I'm like, okay, well, that makes more sense as a written column, where I can hyperlink to other things. I can bring in some stats and educate, and really with some deductive logic say, well, if you agree on this premise, and if you agree on this premise, and if you agree on this premise, then we should agree that this might be true, or at least give it a thought.
Sure.
There's other times where, there's something that's kind of burning and I want to talk about. And, the best place would be, just to get on Tim and Sid and talk to them and have that feedback and that dialogue, that back and forth. And sometimes that's the best platform, or other times, really having a long drawn out conversation over 20, 30, 45 minutes via podcast, where you don't have to think, okay, I got to wrap this interview, this answer up, because I'm not really sure how much B-roll they have in the studio, and I want to keep the show moving, and they got to get to break and all this type of other thing. So sometimes a podcast is the best place to do that. So it really depends on, I think, what type of conversation I'm hoping to have, and where I think my voice can be amplified the most at the time.
When I was going to school, I had a little bit of a luxury. I could just focus on writing the whole way through, from year 1 to year 4 of university. And, if I was back then, I didn't like public speaking. I was a super introverted, shy guy. And if it had anything to do with broadcast or radio, I didn't even want to deal with it. The students today don't have that luxury. They have to come out of school being as well-rounded as possible. So what advice would you give to someone like me back in 2005, someone who is a writer and maybe is not comfortable with broadcast, or conversely, maybe a student who loves podcasting, loves to talk, but might not be a good writer? What advice would you give to them?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I was kind of coming from the opposite direction, where I was more of a video person and then got into the writing after that. I think the main thing I would say is that you don't have to be perfect and you don't have to be polished in terms of that video piece. I mean, some of my favorite people to listen to, whether it's on podcasts or even on TV, are not traditional broadcasters. They didn't, grow up hoping to be on TV. But even, like, to be quite frank, like, their delivery isn't that great. Sometimes their delivery is like overly nerdy, for lack of a better descriptor, but that kind of fits who they are. And ultimately, like, information is key. Like, that information that you're giving is the most important thing. You can work on that other part. You can work on the delivery, and that's just going to get better with reps on its own. But what you can't really work on in the same way is being interesting, speaking with authority, being really, really well researched and well thought out, having a different perspective and making people think. And I think we are in a space where there's a lot of people who are amazing at reading off a prompter and reading a script and delivering to camera. And that is a trait that is great. And it's certainly one that I've tried to work on over time. But I do think that the scarcity of the flip side of people who can present some ideas and think differently makes them ultimately more valuable, and that you're always going to be able to find someone in the industry that can be very polished and read a highlight pack or read off a prompter. And so if you're not that person, don't worry about it. You'll get better over time. But really, for me, the value is in people who can provide more than just prompter reading, right? And that they can provide more perspective. They can think interestingly. And so that's the other thing I would say is, practice, get reps. You are being asked to do more, but you also have more tools to get better. You can start a YouTube page. You can do stuff on your social media. Even just practicing on your stories will make you a little bit more comfortable time after time. You'll have a great understanding of how quickly 15 seconds goes and trying to get a point out succinctly. But I would say, like, you don't have to be Chris Berman or Ron McClain day one. And in fact, if we are having this conversation in 2040, I think that we're going to talk about the David Sings and the Ben Nicholson Smiths in a way that we now talk about the Ron McClains and the James Duthys. Like, I honestly think that I honestly think that we're going in that direction. Like, Ron McClain and James, like, those guys are hosting hockey. Hockey's an institution. So maybe that's not a great example, but in terms of like, let's just use highlight anchors as an example. Like, that used to be, when we were growing up, that used to be the premier job, right? You walk into any sports station, that's the job that everyone wanted. And I still think for many that's the case. And I think when you look at the evaluation in terms of what people were paid, certainly there's still value there. But you can see the tide shifting, because quite frankly, I'm not sure if those shows are going to exist in 20 years. But certainly having thoughtful what's that?
Or 10 for that matter.
Or 10, yeah, no question. But certainly having some great analysis, some thoughtful conversation that sparks interest. Like, that's where the ship's going. I mean, let's just use this as an example. What are the clips that go viral that you're really motivated to share? It's not someone reading a great VO to sound or doing a great highlight pack. It's someone making a really interesting point. And so I would say just keep your focus on having some interesting points, being well researched, giving great analysis. The polish will come over time, over reps, but that piece, which you need to have if you're a writer, is important. And that's why I think we're seeing so many writers have a seamless transition to doing on-air work.
Donnovan, I appreciate you sharing that, sort of embedded within teaching Ryerson students in our sport journalism course is finding their voice, and having something to say. So to your point, it comes down to reading, and becoming educated on a number of different things that you can speak to. And of course, doing your research and being prepared, which all lends to it. And then of course, this idea that, you got to be authentic. You got to be you. The idea that you can have a couple of bullet points that you're thinking about, but how you can actually, focus more on the art of conversation and speaking something in a thoughtful and articulate way, which you obviously do so well. And I think is great advice, not only for students, but, people who want to join the conversation. Do your research and find the courage to have something to say, and don't be afraid to say it in your way. I mean, the worst thing we all hear it, you immediately turn on your broadcast voice. You're like, hello there and welcome. And of course, that's trying to be something you aren't, and thinking that is who you have to be.
It's the worst.
Yeah. And
it's the worst. So in, we're obviously talking to students, and, one of the unintended consequences of Sportsnet or even TSN not having a university sports package and doing games is the individual schools have had to step up in terms of broadcasting, and it's been a great learning experience for a lot of people to get those reps. But listening to different broadcasts across the country, there's many times on a Saturday watching football where I'm like, you're a 21 and 22-year-old in a booth somewhere, and you're trying to talk like you're 50 or 55, using language that you would never use, and putting on a voice that you never use. Like, stop trying to be Rod Smith. Like, Rod Smith is Rod Smith because he's Rod Smith. Be you, right? Like, I don't want to listen to you do a Rod Smith impersonation, because that's not going to be very good. And so you talked about finding your voice, and my delivery got much better when I stopped worrying about my delivery, when I just started talking. And certainly I still get feedback and things that I should be cognizant of, and I'll watch back and look at things that I could improve. But ultimately, I'm just thinking right now about talking to you and having a conversation. And when you say find your voice, that's not just like the audio, like what you sound like. It's really kind of who you are, like what you're adding to the conversation. And we have so much competition in this industry, but the beautiful thing and the other thing, so I lied. The second thing, if you could take two things from this conversation, this is the second one. The thing that people should really focus on when getting into this industry, because there's so much competition and there's so many people who are like, I want to be X. I want to be the next Ben Nicholson Smith, Arash Madani, Kayla Gray, whoever. Understand this, that like there's something unique about you. Like, we're all ones of ones, right? And so your real task in differentiating yourself and finding your voice is figuring out what's unique to you, what makes you innately different to other people, finding that, building that up and making it a strength, so that you get to the point where people are like, I need a David Singh. We don't have a David Singh. Can we find a David Singh for our organization? Or David Singh adds this that we don't have, and only he has it, and that's why we need him. Like, this industry is so competitive, so you can't try and be someone else. You have to figure out what makes you unique, different, and really highlight that and use that to be your voice. So it could be your diversity of experience. It could be your diversity of interests, your intellect. Maybe you're in broadcasting, but you're doing a minor in actuarial sciences. Then bring that into your work, bring that into your writing, right? Lean into that, because that's a piece of expertise that I certainly don't have. So maybe it's the fact that you're bilingual. Figure out how to use that for your benefit. So figure out, and it's not normally one thing, but figure out what the things about you that are different, that are special, that make you unique. Like, we're all snowflakes in a way. And then highlight that and bring that out in your work to the point where, like, it's blinding people. Like, oh my goodness, we need X in our company, on our newspaper, on our streaming platform, and this person is giving it to us in spades.
While we're on the topic of like introspection, I want to ask you about your method when it comes to self-critiquing. For me, when I started off as a feature writer, I was obsessive about critiquing my own work. So first off, I would read all the best feature writers I could, and I would read it twice. I'd read it once for enjoyment. The second time, I would really critique it, like line by line. And then I would apply what I learned in that to my own work. And then I would critique every time I'd have a feature come out, I would critique it and say, okay, when it comes out and it goes through the editing phase, I would say, okay, why did my editor change this? Why does this sound this way? Why could I not get it to look like this, piece that I really admired? And, that was something I did early on until I really gained a confidence with myself. And now I don't do that as much. What's your method nowadays? You've done a lot of video content, right? You've won awards in that regard. Do you critique every piece that comes out? Do you, what's your method when it comes? Do you look back on it as it when it's done, or do you just kind of file it away in your memory and move on to the next piece? How do you treat that? Yeah.
So my wife works in the industry as well. She's a producer. And we can't watch TV without pausing and be like, did you see that? Well, I love what they did there, right? Like, we just can't. That's just how we work and how we think. And so in my embryonic stages in production and TV and doing features, at The Score, I was really pushed by another producer that's around the same age, a guy by the name of Jake Thompson. He's done a lot of work for TSN and CTV. He's a freelancer now. I constantly look at other people's work, and the term I use is professionally jealous, right? So pieces will come, whether it's something that you or Sonny wrote at Sportsnet, or if it's a feature that Paul Sadu produced, or if it's something that like Jeremy Schaap did for ESPN and E60 or Outside the Lines. There's stuff that I see that I'm professionally jealous of. And I'll really, really go through it with a fine tooth comb and be like, okay, like what did they do here that I didn't think of, but really, really worked? And, what could I incorporate in something that I'm doing in the future? Like we're all thieves in this industry, right? Like we all steal from each other, right? It's the greatest compliment. And we all are inspired by each other. And so in terms of like outwardly, that's kind of what I do, is I'm constantly saying, like that, don't like that as much. Interesting. This was really good, man. I need to step my game up because like that feature kicked my ass and I need to get to that level. So just constantly keeping an appraisal, on that depth chart of work of like things that I'm doing. And it comes from all places. It could just be a font that I see on a text, on something on Instagram where I'm like, that's interesting. I'm going to share that to, a couple editors and producers that I work with to kind of get their creative juices flowing. I'm constantly, got different chats on my phone, sending people things that I've watched on Netflix that have given me inspiration and whatnot. I mean, and it's not even just in the work that we do. It's also in just the culture that we have in the workplace and the leadership that kind of we have and how we pull each other up, but also like, we lead, top down or to the side, so there could be a great quote from like Reed Hastings, the co-creator of Netflix. I was like, that's interesting. We should start thinking this way. Let me send it to, our GM or our president or a coworker, editor friend. So it's across the board. Like it's even me thinking about how I am as an employee, a teammate, and not just the work that I produce. And then looking at my work, it's basically kind of going through a test of, after it's done, going through it and being like, let me look at this through the lens of why. Why did I do it this way? Why did I make that choice? Now that it's done, does that decision still stand up? Should I have done it differently? And ultimately, did I just do this task, whatever it is, article, social media, video, podcast, did I just do it to get it done because it was assigned? Or did I do it and did I really, really excel in it? And am I really proud of it? Is it something that if a huge talent agent was about to evaluate me, I would be comfortable with them evaluating that and that alone? And if the answer is no, then I probably didn't bring, enough to the table on it, right? I just did it and got it done. And so I kind of look at those things through that lens. And so that's like the smell test, right? Like we can only have one thing pinned on our social media profile. Like that's kind of how it works. But if you go through something and you're not really proud enough to pin it on your profile, then you probably could have done something different to make it excellent, because there is going to be someone where that's the only piece of content that they consume of yours. That's their only relationship with you. And so similarly, not that I'm like the Michael Jordan of content creation, because far from it, I'm like trying to get to like BJ Armstrong status, but like Michael Jordan's concept of every time I played, someone paid money and it's the only time they're going to see me. So I can give it my best effort. So similarly for us, like whatever that task assignment is, I'm going to go back, look at it. Why did I make all these choices? And, in hindsight, would I do anything different? There's great learnings there. But ultimately, did I really, really try and push the envelope and make this as good as possible? If yes, great. Then I can sleep well and live with the results, good, bad, or indifferent. If no, well, then why? And then that's a further conversation. Was I too tired? Was I too busy? Was I not really enthused with the project? Was the editor terrible? Right? And then the answers to those questions will give you information on how you should go about doing projects in the future. Because no matter what the answer to those questions is, ultimately your name's on it, is your byline. People are evaluating you on it, right? They don't have that context as to why it doesn't live up to the standard that you want to have.
You know, Donnovan, it's a fascinating introspection that you just shared with us with respect to your craft. You know, when we talk about journalism as a craft and your work and your professional pride and your brand and what you stand for, I mean, it's rare that you get that sort of insight and introspection into that process. And that sounds like that's something you're constantly evaluating with respect to your work and your standards and how your work measures up to your standards, and knowing that your standards also can change. But just to sort of pivot, you know, in the wake of George Floyd's death, you know, your work has changed in a very pronounced way. Maybe you could speak a little bit to how your work has changed and even how your perspective of work has changed.
Yeah, I mean, I think the yearning for my work has changed in a pronounced way. I think that's the biggest, difference. I haven't changed certainly as a person, but I think the way people perceive me has changed. And this period from Memorial Day to now, the best way I can describe it is I'm on a book tour for a book I didn't write. So there's lots of interest in me being on different shows, podcasts, me being parts of different boards and councils, and giving people advice and taking calls and meetings. So naturally, it's forced me to think about all of these ideas, concepts, maybe even more so than I would have, because I'm being asked about it more so certainly than I would have. And it's just natural that that's going to bleed into my work, right? That stream of consciousness that I'm constantly having is going to be poured into my work and how I tell stories. And it becomes a bit of a snowball where as that it becomes a focal point in my work, and there's a yearning for those types of stories, then there's more interest for me to tell those stories, and naturally I'm doing it more and more and more. So I think, the biggest change is how receptive people have become to having those conversations, to having conversations about race and anti-Black racism, or racism, no matter who it's against, about things like police brutality, about systemic, oppression and inequality. There's more reception to having those narratives in sports stories and sports conversations. And so I think that's made me a little bit more in demand, quite frankly, but I think it's also opened some people's eyes to kind of say like, oh, interesting. I didn't know, that I was able to speak, with some clarity and some thought on these issues. So it's been it's kind of like running a marathon. I'll see how many sports metaphors I can get in here, but it's kind of like running a marathon in the sense that anyone who's whether it's cycling or long distance running, they get this concept that it's kind of in waves. So there's going to be times you're feeling really good and you're flying, and the people cheering on the side are giving you energy, and the other runners are really carrying you, and you feel good. You want to ride that wave as long as possible. And there's going to be other stretches where you feel that lactic acid build up, and it's just putting one foot in front of the other, and you can't imagine how you're going to get to the finish line. And so that's, for me, how this conversation is. Sometimes I'm energized by the fact that people are willing to have it, and that I have this place at Sportsnet where I can have it in multiple ways. And I think that I have some things that are worth saying. And other times it is a bit more arduous. It's difficult to talk about it. It makes you vulnerable, certainly. It's not a fun, uplifting subject. And I personally got into sports because I wanted to talk about things that are fun or exciting. And this is not a topic that is one. And so it kind of ebbs and flows. But ultimately, they're important conversations. And I know not everyone that looks like me has the ability or the platform to have them. So I don't want to waste the fact that I do.
I just asked a quick follow-up. Just sorry, David, to cut.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, what kind of toll has this had on you? Like, how's the body feeling?
The body's okay right now. No, it's good. I mean, I'm I really I can't complain. Not to say that it's not difficult, but I do have a pretty even keel kind of way about me where I don't really get too high or too low. I'm not really phased. I think you see a lot on social media, which is not always favorable. And certainly that has some sort of impact, right? But it doesn't really bother me. It probably bothers my family more than it bothers me. I do have concerns about being pigeonholed in that, oh yeah, there's like the race guy, where my real task is to cover sports and to have a conversation not just about NBA players protesting, but NBA players putting up prolific numbers as well, right? So that's certainly a concern, even though I love that people see me as one of the voices of authority at this time. That's something that I kind of weigh. But ultimately, I'm blessed. I'm gainfully employed. I have the opportunity to speak about it as much or as little as I want to. So it's the culmination of it. Probably will take its toll, right? But for the most part, I've been able to get through it and navigate it. Which again, that's kind of how it hits and resonates with me. But I know many others, other journalists that I talk to, mostly Black specifically, but even others that aren't Black, just visible minorities and BIPOC people say that it has been more challenging for them, and that it hasn't been easy. And I get that, and I know even though it hasn't been as arduous for me, I totally empathize with those who it's been a real struggle for, and I also know that I could be at that place at some point in the future too. But right now and in general, I've been okay. I feel like in general, whether it's a racial reckoning, the pandemic, our political sphere, when people ask how you're doing, I feel like we're all grading on a curve a little bit, right? So as I grade on a curve, I'm doing well relative to kind of the world that we live in right now.
You just mentioned not wanting to be pigeonholed, and you did mention that in your big read on the lack of diversity in Canadian sport media. We asked our students to read that, and just some context as well that I think it's important for our students to hear, and it's important for me to tell you. You've heard this probably 100 times from other people, but the amount of bravery that took, I think it should be commended, but B, I can speak for myself and for a bunch of minorities in this profession who, as we were reading it, you kind of took on a role that very few of us could. We were reading it, and I was reading it and pumping my fist as I was reading certain sentences. You said a lot of things that I would never feel comfort saying. You put a target on your back. At what point writing that did that sink in, or did it sink in at all? That hey, I'm putting myself and my livelihood on the line here. I'm making myself a target, but how do you weigh that with, hey, this needs to be written. Somebody needs to say this. Can you take us through what was, going through your mind at that point with those subjects?
Yeah, certainly. And by the way, you saying that you don't know if you'd be willing to say something or write something is pretty telling, because I don't know how much you're not willing to say or write. But and I believe I referenced things that you have tweeted that took great courage. So basically, like, my overall, in a way, probably naively, I didn't approach that story any differently than any of the stories I had written in that period or in general. My basic thought when thinking about like a column like that, like an opinion piece, is it's pretty binary. I've got these kind of thoughts going through my head about what I feel about whatever's going on in sports or the world. And I basically think to myself, like, what is my thought on this, my belief, my stance? What can I add to the conversation that is not being said or is not being illuminated? And like, do people care? Like, is there an audience, right? Ultimately, I could think that this concept is great and this story would be great and I could write it beautifully. But if no one really cares, then who am I doing it for? Myself? And so I really approached it this exact same way. We were having this conversation that was not just about police brutality anymore. We were having this conversation about theoretically BIPOC individuals having a knee on their neck in many different ways in our culture, not just on the pavement by a police officer, and in industry, in housing, in journalism. And so I was thinking about my experience through that lens and how really it wasn't unique to me, that I could cite some real specific examples and cases, but that the through line is many other people had similar examples and cases that they could cite. I know many other people either don't have the ability to write it or probably weren't in a space where they felt comfortable to, but at that point I kind of felt like very comfortable in writing it. And it was only, our communal friend and editor, Evan Rosser, who was kind of like, you do know that some people might take this, X, Y, and Z ways. And then I was like, okay. Well, I mean, I hadn't really thought about it that much, but I mean, ultimately my job here is to find things that I think that are interesting, that I think people want to read and that I could add the conversation to. This is one. So let's do it. And I'm pretty comfortable, rolling with the consequences. And by and large, the feedback was great and supportive. So yeah, I didn't, even though it's certainly a piece that I'm very proud of, and definitely one that I got a lot of good feedback on, not just, hey, I really liked it, but more so, it was therapeutic for some people to read, which is great because, I'm writing with, in a way, an audience of one. So I love the fact that it connected with other people because the struggle is not just mine. It's for many others. But yeah, I honestly just approached it probably naively, like the piece that I wrote about the fact that, Black people are dying and the white athletes need to speak up. Like the piece that I wrote about, the fact that the NFL isn't dealing with COVID-19 in a responsible way. Like it really, the thought process in my head going to the story wasn't really much different, right? This is a belief that I have. Can I actually make a compelling case? Am I the right person to be making it and adding to the conversation and not just having, the same conversation that other people are already having? And would people want to consume it? So yeah, that was pretty much it.
Yeah, I really like what you say there, Donnovan. I mean, this, just bringing it back to the theme we talked about earlier about finding your voice. I mean, and you having found your voice and then using that voice to be an advocate for change and to talk about real issues that we're facing within the Canadian sport media currently right now is, even if there wasn't a built-in audience, in many ways, you really created awareness of something that I think was, has been occurring certainly since I've entered into that space for, over 20 years now. So let me just sort of ask you, and I know we're just about out of time, so maybe a nice way to wrap it up. Any advice for whether it be students or for people in terms of being an advocate for change? How do we create more diversity and inclusion within this, within sport media in this country?
Yeah. So in terms of being an advocate for change or an ally for change, I mean, David, I'm sure you've gotten this email or this DM or this text, a lot over the last little bit, like, hey, just checking in on you. Hope you're okay. I'm listening. I'm learning. What can I do to be an ally? Like some version of that. And so the thing that I would say is, well, one is that like it is a lifestyle. It's not a destination. So you don't just like cross the end zone. Hey, I'm an ally now. I'm on the right side of history. Thank you. I'm here. Right. Like you're constantly working at it, constantly improving it. And the other thing is, it just comes down to being a good teammate, whether it's in your family or friend relationships, whether it's you as an employee or just all of us as we're connected in our communities, in our society. And so the example I would use is the way I try to be an ally, because I mean, I have blind spots as well. And I also have privilege as well. Being a male, I know I have privilege in our industry that some of our female counterparts don't. So if I use that as an example of trying to, be a male feminist, if you will, I look at my female counterparts and I say, okay, I may have access to some people that she may not be comfortable having those conversations. What can I do to help? Well, I can use that access to highlight and spotlight good things that she's doing that maybe they're not aware of. I can also, on the flip side, encourage her on the good things that she's doing, so she kind of is getting that feedback, and put a spotlight on what she's doing. I also can be cognizant of my language and the way I interact with her, because I have a blind spot. I could be constantly checking in with females that I trust, other coworkers that are friends, my wife, to make sure that I am being sensitive and I am having a full understanding and having their perspective. Like those are all ways that I can, in my role, be a champion for women. And so being an ally to someone who has maybe a different, religion than you, or who is, from a marginalized group, or really from any equity-seeking group, right? Whether it's someone who's part of the LGBTQ plus community or somebody with a disability, it really doesn't change, right? The things that they'd be dealing with changes. Your relationship to the things that they'd be dealing with and your understanding changes. But ultimately, what it is understanding where your privilege is, where your power is, and figuring out how you can redirect it, not to strip anything away from yourself, but to help someone else in a similar spot, right? So that's basically, in a nutshell, how you can be. And we use the term ally. I mean, I personally like the term teammate a bit more, again, maybe because of my sports background. But, if I think about allies, when the United Nations get together, it's like, okay, well, like, if you have an issue and like it's aligned for me politically, like we'll be allies and I'll help you in that case. But like a teammate is someone who is there for you regardless of time and score, regardless of situation. If it's good for you, it's good for me, and vice versa, right? You have to at times sacrifice for the benefit of others, because collectively, together, everyone, can achieve more. And so that's the way I think of this. I don't necessarily want an ally. I want someone who's willing to roll up their sleeves and be in the fight with me. I want someone to be just as upset as I am when they see the George Floyd video or the Jacob Blake video, or when they see the lack of representation on boards in media companies or in the C-suites and executive offices. I don't want them really to do me a favor. I want them to be as moved to maybe make things a little bit more equitable. And for no other reason, if it's not for morals, than for money. Like, we know there's been enough data and stats and research, but we know that Fortune 500 companies and media companies perform better when they're diverse in thought, in experience, in ideas. And so just if you want to be a part of a winning organization, if you want to be part of an organization that is going to make more money quarter after quarter, year after year, that's going to have more money to thus pay you and hopefully not lay you off or lay off your friends, then it's in your best interest, selfishly, to make sure that your organization is more diverse. And there is a distinction between diverse and inclusive. You could just look at the numbers and say, oh yeah, we've got lots of representation. We've got 50 men and women. We've got lots of different ethnic backgrounds, but but diversity is not enough. Inclusion is the fact that everyone has a voice, has the ability to not have a glass ceiling, but potentially move up and be a hiring manager or director or a president. And so certainly as we want to be intentional about making sure our industry is more diverse, really it's as if not more important that our industry is inclusive, because if it's not, if all of the quote unquote diverse candidates are working on the floor and all of the old boys club is still in the C-suites, well, that's actually, just as harmful. And so those are the things that I would say to people who want to be advocates and allies in this moment.
Okay, Donnovan, we're running up against the clock now, so just want to say thank you. I mean, I was able to learn a lot about this. I'm sure Dan was, or from this, and I know for a fact our students will as well. This is our first of the year, and this has definitely set the tone in the right way. So thank you very much for coming on, man.
Anytime, my pleasure.
I'll echo what he just said, Donnovan. I mean, for you to take an hour out of your time to join us and be so forthright and honest and open with your answers, I mean, we just genuinely appreciate it. So on behalf of David, Donnovan, and myself, that's our office hours for this week. Take care.